Alright class, today we are in chapter 10 looking at how monopolies work. So first we'll look at how do monopolies get created in the first place. There can be some what we call natural barriers to establish a monopoly. There can also be barriers created by government policies. Now remember back in our earlier chapter we talked about perfect competition. One condition there that was important was free entry and free exit. That is, new firms can enter the market or old firms can leave the market costlessly. That's not true for monopolies. So that condition is violated. There are some kinds of barriers, either natural or government, that allow monopolies to arise in the first place. So once we learn about how monopolies arise, we'll see how they maximize profit. It'll be a different condition than what we learned about in the last chapter. Now, more often than not, monopolies are a bad thing for the economy, so we'll see what precisely those issues are, and then we'll look at what kinds of policy solutions can be used to address them. Our very last section here is about monopsony. That is not a misspelling of monopoly, that's actually a real word. What that means is that there's going to be a single buyer in the market. So a monopoly is a single seller, monopsony, single buyer. Alright, let's see how monopolies arise. So definition, monopolies are just a single seller in the market. We saw that in the previous chapter about perfect competition. The firms are, we saw they're price takers. They have no ability to set price. They have to take the market price as given. That's not true for monopolies. Monopolies do have price setting power. We call that market power. So the strength of that market power is going to depend upon whether or not there are close substitutes. If there are similar goods that are being sold, that can dilute the monopoly's power. So here's one example out of many. Back when I was in Kirksville, Missouri, teaching at Truman State, there's a band of professors there who called themselves Strange Accents, and they were this rock band. It was very surprising. We had this rather soft-spoken, very gentle colleague in economics, and she's got this secret double life and a rock band, and she's married to a history professor who also is like a pretty regular history professor guy, normal teacher, but then on his website he's got things like a day is wasted if you don't get wasted, so he's also got this double life. Anyways, they got their own band and they have some of their own songs. Now we'll see later that governments give songmakers a copyright over their songs, so they have a monopoly over the music they create. But they are very far from being the only rock band out there. There are many, many other rock bands producing similar music, so Strange Access does not have a whole lot of market power over their product. If they try to jack their price up really high on their music, people are just going to start buying cheaper substitutes that are still the same genre. Now your book points out that monopolists are not always profitable. However, more often than not, it can be a very lucrative business to be in. Your textbook publisher, I imagine, is probably doing very, very well selling books for more than $100 each, when the marginal cost of making them is probably way, way less than that. So most monopolists are probably doing very, very well. That would be attractive to new entrepreneurs to start trying to join the same business and try to take away some of those profits. So how monopolists last is there have to be some high barriers to entry. If just anyone could join this market and start collecting those profits, then monopolies would be very short-lived. So that's why this high barriers to entry condition is very important for monopolies. So we said in the introduction there are two kinds of barriers. There are natural barriers and there are also government-created barriers. So one kind of natural barrier is economies of scale. We learned about this back in chapter 8. So where we had ATC for average total cost, we distinguish between short-run average total cost and long-run average total cost. So if the long-run average total costs are decreasing as quantity rises, then we say that the firm has economies of scale. So that was our definition. You can see why that would make it possible to establish a monopoly. If you're a really big firm in this market, then your average costs are going to be very, very low. If some new firm tries to compete with you, they're going to be somewhere back here. They're going to have much higher costs, so they're going to be more expensive. They're not going to be able to beat you in market competition. Here's one example. So a very popular example is the market for electricity. To set up your own electric grid, it's going to be super expensive. Once you have the infrastructure in place, though, you're just trying to supply one extra household with power, that's pretty cheap. So you got this big upfront cost over here in our diagram where you're setting up your power plant. After that, supplying extra households with power, very, very cheap, so costs keep going down and down on average as you expand. So the market might start out as being competitive, but then once one firm gets ahead, once one firm gets an advantage and gets a bigger market share, they're going to have lower costs and always undercut their rivals on price, and it's going to be just one monopolist left there in the long run. So economies of scale can arise in certain industries like electricity. These naturally tend to create monopolies, so we call these kinds of firms natural monopolies. So that's the first way that monopolies can arise naturally. The second way is through difficulties in raising capital. Some kinds of industries, by their very nature, require a huge amount of capital to get started. I'll pick one example of airlines. Now, airlines are not currently a monopoly, but they do have a lot of the right ingredients in place, so maybe that will change in the future. So if you want to start your own airline, you got to start out by buying your own plane. Those things are not cheap. So even though my uncle likes planes a lot, there's no lack of enthusiasm on his part, we're probably not going to see a Spencer Airlines come up anytime soon. It's just too expensive, and trying to get a bank to give you a loan, try to persuade them that you can make this happen, is going to be pretty tough. Banks want to have collateral for a loan. If the loan goes bad, if you fail to pay them back, they're going to want to be able to have some kind of asset they can foreclose on, and unless you're really rich, you're not going to be able to do that to start your own airline. So airlines have very high barriers to entry in the forms of difficulty of raising capital. Like I said before, airlines are not currently a monopoly, but there have been some mergers in recent decades, and if that continues, maybe we'll become a monopoly in the future. We'll have to watch and see what happens. So economies of scale can give you monopolies. That can be a natural barrier. You can also have difficulties in raising capital. That's another barrier that can create monopolies. A third way that can naturally lead to a monopoly is what if you have control of resources. So in a number of oil-producing countries, there's a single state-owned company that owns all the oil fields. So if your company has all the oil fields, they're going to produce all the oil. It's just the way it works. So seizing all the inputs would be clearly an advantage in those kinds of markets. So there are three kinds of natural barriers. There are control of resources, there are economies of scale, and there are also difficulties in raising capital. Now sometimes governments also create barriers that can lead to the creation of monopolies. So one kind of government-created barrier is licensing. In the US, only the post office is allowed to deliver mail. Now there are private companies that can deliver packages. There's UPS, stuff like that, but letters and mail, that's post office only. Some industries are also require licensing by their nature. So I used to work at Truman State University in a small town, Kirksville, Missouri, they only had one hospital. For some pretty obvious reasons, you have to have a license to operate a hospital. You can't just some average guy who's read a lot of health blogs open his own hospital. That's not going to work very well. So hospitals need licenses, and in a small town, there's only one company that decided to seek a license in that particular area. So that government licensing created a monopoly in healthcare in Kirksville. Now, there's been some controversy over licensing. There are obviously some legitimate reasons to have licenses for things like doctors and hospitals. You want to make sure those healthcare providers know what they're doing, otherwise they could cause a lot of damage. Other industries, however, have started requiring licensing that is maybe not quite so essential. So I was hearing stories about just to cut hair or arrange flowers in some states, you have to get a license that requires hundreds, if not 1,000 hours of training. That seems rather excessive. That's just an unnecessary barrier to entry. So some legitimate reasons for licensing, some reasons are not quite so legitimate. Another government-created barrier comes in the form of intellectual property laws. Those come in the form of patents and copyrights. So if a drug company decides to invent a new drug, or hopefully if someone finds a vaccine against a coronavirus, we give them a monopoly over that drug by giving them a patent. So for a certain number of years, only that company can produce and sell that drug or that vaccine. We also have copyrights for authors. So if you write your own book, only you are allowed to sell that book and make copies of it, and that gives you a monopoly for a certain number of years. The length of the copyrights varies by country, so you have to look up what the laws are for your own country, but pretty broadly we do have copyrights for authors and other artists who create works like that. So we'll see later on this chapter that most of the time monopolies are a bad thing, but there are some legitimate reasons to have monopolies. And one case can be if you have very high fixed costs in industry. That's why the government intentionally creates monopolies with patents and copyrights. Let's go back to our earlier example with a drug company. They've manufactured some new drug, and making a new drug is not cheap. It takes a lot of time and a lot of research and probably a lot of failures too. Not every new idea you have is going to work. So you pay a lot of scientists to do a lot of work in laboratories, spend a lot of money on equipment and chemicals. They might have actually poured $1 billion into creating a new drug. So that large investment is a fixed cost. The marginal cost for the drug company is how much did it cost them to make the very last bottle of pills that they produced. Now we know there's some good properties of perfect competition. We learned about that earlier. We saw that perfectly competitive markets tend to be efficient. We also know that for perfect competition, the profit maximizing rule is price equals marginal cost. If we had perfect competition for drugs, then the price a drug company would charge would be equal to the price of the cost of that very last bottle of pills they made. So that marginal cost would be quite low. If that's going to be your price, that makes it very, very hard, probably impossible, to recover that big fixed cost of developing that drug. As a result, if you have perfect competition for drugs, then there's going to be very low incentives to create drugs, and creating new drugs will be unprofitable. As a result, drug companies will stop researching new drugs and will stop seeing advances in medicine. That's not very desirable. So if you're wondering, why does it cost so much money for a tiny little bottle of pills? Well, you're not paying just for the pills. you're also paying for that big fixed cost, those hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that were spent on researching the drug. So if perfect competition is not going to work for drugs, here's what we do instead. We give that drug company a monopoly for a limited amount of time. So for that limited amount of time, they can charge a higher price and make monopolist profits, and hopefully those will be large enough for them to recover that fixed cost. So now making drugs is profitable again, and that gives companies an incentive to keep researching and keep trying to find ways to make life better for us and improve healthcare. So there can be some legitimate reasons for allowing some monopolies. Now, those patents do expire eventually, so once the company's had enough time to cover that fixed cost, then we go back to perfect competition, and anyone can make those drugs. They can make generic versions of the drug once the patent expires. So we try to get the best of both worlds. Let them recover their fixed costs, but also allow competition in the long run. So let's go back to our other example that was about giving musicians a copyright for their music. So I mentioned that band Strange Accents before. Writing your own song, writing your own good song, is a lot of work. That probably took them a lot of time that they could have been doing other things with. So it's a big fixed cost involved with writing a song. Now the marginal cost of distributing your song is going to be very, very low. Maybe they still have the traditional CDs, so the cost of the last CD being the marginal cost, that's going to be very, very low. Or if you're spreading the music over the internet by letting people download your song, that cost is going to be pretty close to zero. So once again, if you have perfect competition, you're constrained by price equals marginal cost, and that's going to be almost impossible for these guys to make a profit, almost impossible to get any compensation for that big fixed cost in doing all that research. As a result, there'll be very little incentive for artists to put in the effort to create new songs or write new books or create other works of art. Instead, we get them a monopoly through a copyright, so they can make a profit and recover those fixed costs with their music. Now they have an incentive to keep doing what they love and make new songs. Another case where it's legitimate to create a monopoly. So we do have laws against copyright infringement. I know probably a lot of you guys are not following them. I do encourage you to obey copyright laws and to support all the artists and musicians out there who are providing us with entertainment. So that wraps up our section on how monopolies arise. Stay tuned for our next episode. When we come back, we'll learn how monopolies maximize profit.